The night was still in Walburg, North Carolina, when a desperate voice broke the silence. On August 2, 2015, a panicked 911 call was placed just after 3 a.m. The caller was Thomas Martens, a 65-year-old former FBI agent, his voice trembling but determined. "There's blood everywhere," he told the dispatcher. "I think we killed him." That last line, raw, unnerving, and impossible to ignore, would echo through courtrooms, newspapers, and family conversations for years to come. What exactly had unfolded in that house on Panther Creek Court? Who was the man lying on the floor, beaten so savagely that investigators struggled to describe the scene without emotion? And why would his new wife and her father insist it had been a fight for survival? The victim was Jason Corbett, a 39-year-old Irishman who had moved across an ocean for what he believed would be a second chance at love. Yet here he was, lying on his bedroom floor, his skull fractured by a brick bathed in blood, and a baseball bat swung with relentless force. Jason had once dreamed of building a life for his two young children, of finding stability after tragedy. Instead, his life ended in violence, and the two people claiming to protect themselves from him were the very ones now standing over his body. The horror inside that home did not come from nowhere. To truly understand how a man who had survived heartbreak in Ireland ended up dead in America, we must rewind the story. Behind this murder lay years of complicated relationships, unanswered questions about Jason's first wife, and the entrance of a woman who would change the course of his life forever. Jason Corbett grew up in Limerick, Ireland, a man rooted in family and community. By his early 30s, he had what many considered the foundations of happiness: a career, a marriage, and two children, Jack and Sarah. His wife, Margaret Maggs Fitzpatrick, was known to friends as warm and devoted, though privately she struggled with fragile health. In 2006, that fragility proved fatal. At only 30 years old, Maggs died suddenly, with official reports citing an asthma attack. Her death was devastating for Jason. Overnight, he became a widower with two small children, their futures uncertain and their mother gone. Friends remembered Jason as shattered but fiercely protective of his kids. He was determined that Jack and Sarah would grow up in a stable home, even if it meant he had to rebuild his life from the ground up. In time, though, he realized he couldn't do it alone. Between work and childcare, Jason faced long days and even longer nights. That was when the idea of hiring an au pair first took root. Enter Molly Martens. Blonde, American, and only in her mid-20s, Molly had grown up in Tennessee in the shadow of a father who had built a career with the FBI. In 2008, she traveled to Ireland to work as Jason's live-in nanny. To outsiders, she seemed to bring brightness into the Corbett household. She played with Jack and Sarah, provided structure, and offered Jason companionship. Over time, a bond formed between Jason and Molly, one that blurred the lines between professional caretaker and something far more personal. By 2011, that bond had become official. Jason and Molly married, blending the roles of stepmother, nanny, and wife into one. For Jason, it felt like the second chance he'd been waiting for, a way to restore the family life he had lost. He accepted a job transfer to North Carolina, uprooting his children and relocating across the Atlantic to begin anew. To the world, the Corbetts appeared like a family chasing the American dream. But beneath the polished surface, tensions began to simmer. Even before they left Ireland, there were whispers. Some of Jason's family members never fully trusted Molly. They worried about her intentions, about her influence on Jason and the children. Friends recalled moments of strain, subtle hints that not everything was as harmonious as Jason wanted it to appear. Yet he pressed forward, convinced that Molly offered stability for his family. In North Carolina, Jason's life looked idyllic on paper. He worked in the packaging industry, providing well for his family. The children attended local schools, and the Corbetts settled into suburban life. But neighbors would later testify to arguments, raised voices behind closed doors, and an undercurrent of discord that never fully went away. Molly, by several accounts, felt isolated and resentful. She had traded her independence for a role she sometimes described as suffocating. Those tensions escalated when her father, Thomas Martens, began spending more time in their home. To some, it looked like a supportive family connection, a father watching over his daughter. To others, it looked like an intrusion. Thomas was protective, perhaps overly so, and he harbored doubts about Jason's treatment of Molly. The Martens family narrative was that Jason was controlling, sometimes cruel, and that Molly's well-being was in jeopardy. The Corbett family narrative painted a different picture. Molly as manipulative, volatile, and prone to dramatic exaggerations. The truth, as always, lay buried somewhere between competing versions of events. By 2015, the marriage was fraying. Jason confided to friends and family in Ireland that he was unhappy. He hinted that he was considering returning home with his children. That possibility loomed over Molly like a threat. If Jason left her, she would lose not only her husband but also the children she had helped raise for nearly a decade. For someone who had invested her identity in being their stepmother, that prospect was unbearable. And so, on that August night, the fragile balance of their lives shattered. According to the Martens, the argument began suddenly. They claimed Jason had become violent, that Molly was being choked, that her life was in imminent danger. Thomas, they said, rushed to her defense, wielding a baseball bat to save his daughter. In the chaos, Jason fell, fought back, and was struck repeatedly until he stopped moving. Molly, too, allegedly grabbed a brick from her bedside table, a brick she said she kept for self-protection, and joined the struggle. By their account, the fight was brutal but necessary. But the crime scene told a different story. Investigators who entered the bedroom described a scene drenched in blood. Jason had been hit at least 10 times in the head, the force so extreme that his skull was left fragmented. Forensics suggested he had been incapacitated, possibly unconscious, when some of the blows were delivered. The violence was not the chaotic flailing of self-defense but the focused ferocity of something more. Even more unsettling was the timing. When paramedics arrived, Jason's body was already cold. This suggested that more time had passed between the fatal blows and the 911 call than the Martens admitted. Why had there been a delay? What had happened in those unaccounted-for minutes? As the news broke, shockwaves rippled across 2 continents. In Ireland, Jason's family reeled. His sister, Tracy Corbett Lynch, became his most vocal advocate, insisting her brother had been murdered in cold blood. She dismissed the idea that Jason was abusive, describing him instead as a loving father who adored his children. To her, Molly and Thomas were not survivors of an attack but perpetrators of a calculated killing. In North Carolina, prosecutors began to build their case. They pointed to the forensic evidence, the sheer number of blows, the chilling words caught on the 911 call. "I think we killed him." That phrase, so stark, seemed less like panic and more like a grim admission. Yet in the court of public opinion, the battle lines were drawn. Was Jason Corbett a man with a hidden violent streak, a danger to his wife, and a threat neutralized in a moment of fear? Or was he the true victim, ambushed in his own bedroom by a wife and father-in-law whose resentment had finally boiled over? The answers would not come easily. Over the years, the case would twist through trials, appeals, and public debate, each side clinging fiercely to its version of truth. But in that first moment, in those blood-soaked early hours of August 2, one undeniable fact remained. Jason Corbett's life had been extinguished in a storm of violence. The question of why would haunt everyone who tried to piece the story together. And as investigators dug deeper, peeling back the layers of Jason and Molly's relationship, they uncovered a marriage far darker and more fractured than either family wanted to admit. They had crossed an ocean for a dream. A fresh start, a new home, a promise that the grief of the past could be buried beneath the bright Carolina sun. At least, that's what Jason Corbett believed when he brought his children and new wife, Molly, to Walburg, North Carolina. On paper, it was the kind of life people aspired to. A comfortable suburban house, a steady job in packaging, and the chance to rebuild family life after tragedy. But behind closed doors, the dream began to fracture almost as soon as it had formed. At first, neighbors saw what looked like stability. Jason drove to work each morning, Molly cared for Jack and Sarah, and the family joined local activities. Molly tried to present herself as a dedicated stepmother, determined to fill the shoes Jason's first wife had left behind. But there was an invisible line between intention and acceptance. Jack and Sarah, though still young, never called her mom. To them, Molly was always Molly, the woman who had arrived after their mother's death, a presence they tolerated but never fully embraced. That subtle distance weighed on Molly. She had invested herself in these children, had tied her future to theirs, and yet she could not shake the feeling that they saw her as an outsider. Friends later remembered her frustration when Jason's children resisted her authority, sometimes challenging her rules or running to Jason when conflicts arose. In Molly's mind, Jason often sided with them, leaving her feeling isolated in her own household. Jason's family back in Ireland noticed the strain as well. Phone calls and visits revealed small but telling details. Molly's temper, her jealousy, her resentment when Jason wanted to spend time with the children alone. Tracy Corbett Lynch, Jason's sister, would later testify that Jason confided in her about the difficulties of his second marriage. He hinted at Molly's mood swings, her tendency to twist minor disagreements into battles. He never said he was afraid of her, but there was an unmistakable weariness in his words, a sense of being trapped in a relationship that was wearing him down. Molly, meanwhile, felt increasingly cornered. To her, Jason was a man who dismissed her contributions, who undermined her role as a stepmother, and who left her vulnerable in a house where she had no real power. The fact that Jason remained close to his late wife's family only deepened her insecurity. Every phone call to Ireland, every holiday spent with the Fitzpatricks, was a reminder that she could never erase Mags from the children's hearts, or from Jason. The cracks in the marriage widened. Neighbors recalled raised voices carrying through the walls. Jack and Sarah's schoolteachers noticed subtle signs of strain, moments when the children seemed withdrawn or distracted. The family was unraveling, and both Jason and Molly seemed to know it. It was during this period of turmoil that Thomas Martens, Molly's father, began spending more time in their lives. A retired FBI agent, Thomas carried himself with the confidence of someone used to authority. He was protective of his daughter to a fault, and as Molly's marriage faltered, he positioned himself as her ally. According to the Martens' version of events, Jason was domineering, even emotionally abusive. Molly confided in her parents about arguments, about feeling unsafe, about being controlled. Thomas claimed he had reason to believe Jason might one day harm his daughter. Jason's family, however, painted the opposite picture. They said Molly exaggerated every disagreement, manipulating her father into believing she was in danger. The truth of their relationship remains contested, but one thing is certain. By 2015, Jason was contemplating a life without Molly. Friends in Ireland said he was considering moving back home with Jack and Sarah. He worried about Molly's influence over the children, about her volatile temper, about the future they faced if things continued as they were. To Jason, returning to Ireland represented not only a return to his roots, but also a way to protect his children from a toxic environment. For Molly, the prospect of losing Jason was devastating, not because of the marriage itself, but because of what it meant for her connection to the children. If Jason left, she would lose the two people she had raised for most of their young lives. The bond she claimed as her own would be severed overnight. That fear was something she admitted openly. Without Jason, she would have no legal right to see Jack or Sarah again. The emotional tension in the Corbett household was like a storm cloud that refused to break. Jason's love for his children was unconditional, and he increasingly viewed Molly as a barrier to their well-being. Molly, in turn, saw Jason's doubts as a betrayal. The result was a marriage balanced precariously on resentment, mistrust, and unspoken threats. It wasn't only emotions that betrayed the fractures. Jason began documenting his unease in subtle ways: conversations with friends, notes exchanged with his sister, hints that he felt trapped and unsure of what to do. He didn't want another public scandal, didn't want his children scarred by a bitter divorce, yet he feared what might happen if he stayed. He was caught between his loyalty to his children and the dangerous instability of a marriage that no longer felt safe. On the Martens' side, the narrative was starkly different. Molly and her parents portrayed Jason as controlling, quick-tempered, even violent. They pointed to small moments, a raised voice, an argument that escalated as evidence of something darker beneath the surface. Whether those accounts were exaggerations, misunderstandings, or rooted in reality, they became the foundation of what would later be their legal defense. As 2015 wore on, the tension deepened. Jason's trips back to Ireland became more significant, each one fueling speculation that he might not return to North Carolina permanently. Molly grew increasingly paranoid, convinced that Jason was preparing to take the children away. She confided in friends that she feared being abandoned, left with nothing after years of sacrifice. What no one realized was just how close the marriage was to collapse. Jason was already exploring legal avenues for custody, quietly gathering information on how to protect his children if he ended the relationship. Molly, for her part, seemed to be preparing for a confrontation of her own, one that would not end with lawyers and courtrooms. And through it all, Thomas Martin stood by his daughter's side. The retired agent presented himself as calm and protective, but prosecutors would later argue that his presence only fueled the situation. He believed Jason was a threat. He believed Molly was in danger, and whether by persuasion or by personal conviction, he made himself a permanent fixture in their home. The stage was set. A marriage on the brink, 2 children caught in the middle, and a father-in-law ready to intervene. The storm that had been brewing for years was about to explode in a single night of unimaginable violence. In the days leading up to August 2, Molly seemed restless. Jason, too, appeared distracted, weighed down by decisions he hadn't yet made. Friends later recalled sensing that something was building, though none could have predicted the brutality that was about to unfold. What began as a marriage meant to heal grief had instead become a battlefield where love, fear, and desperation collided. And when the breaking point came, it would leave 1 man dead, 2 people on trial, and 2 children caught in a war of narratives that would define their lives. The tragedy of Jason Corbett's story was not just that he died violently, but that the warning signs had been visible long before the fatal blows were struck. Yet no one intervened in time. The question that still lingers: could it have been prevented? As investigators pieced together the events of that night, they realized they weren't just unraveling a single act of violence. They were unraveling years of tension, resentment, and choices that had set the Corbett family on a path toward destruction. And when the truth finally emerged in a North Carolina courtroom, the world would be forced to ask, was this truly self-defense, or was it the calculated silencing of a man determined to break free? The clock had just passed 3 a.m. when the frantic voice of Thomas Martens cut through the static of a North Carolina emergency line. The retired FBI agent spoke quickly, almost breathlessly. "My daughter's husband," he told the dispatcher. "He's threatening her. He's choking her. We need help." Then came the words that sent chills down the spine of everyone who later listened to the recording. "I think we killed him." For the first responders rushing to Panther Creek Court that night, nothing could have prepared them for the scene awaiting inside the Corbett home. In the upstairs bedroom, Jason Corbett lay on the floor, his body battered, his head shattered by repeated blows. Blood pooled around him, soaking the carpet, spattering the walls, marking the violent struggle that had taken place only moments before. Nearby lay 2 weapons, a heavy concrete paving brick and a Louisville Slugger baseball bat. Both were smeared with blood and hair. Both had been used, prosecutors would later argue, with a level of force that was anything but defensive. Jason was beyond saving. His body was cold to the touch, his skull fractured in multiple places. The brutality was shocking even to seasoned investigators. The sheer number of blows suggested not a moment of desperation, but a sustained and deliberate attack. Molly and her father were in the house, shaken but physically unharmed. Molly's face was flushed, her demeanor tense. Thomas, though rattled, remained composed as though already preparing the narrative he would deliver to law enforcement. Together, they told the story of a violent domestic dispute. Jason had been drinking, they said, and had turned aggressive. He had choked Molly, pinning her down, leaving her gasping for air. Thomas claimed he intervened, striking Jason with the bat to save his daughter's life. Molly admitted to wielding the brick, also in self-defense. To them, it had been a fight for survival, a desperate bid to stop a violent man. But the evidence raised troubling questions. Paramedics arriving at the scene found Jason's body unnaturally cold for someone who had supposedly just been killed minutes earlier. That detail suggested a delay between his death and the 911 call, a delay long enough to make investigators wonder what the Martens had been doing before summoning help. The crime scene itself told its own story. Jason had severe injuries to his head, including multiple deep lacerations and fractures. The medical examiner later described the trauma as catastrophic, far exceeding what would be necessary to stop an attacker. One blow might be defensive. 2 could be desperation. But 10, delivered with a heavy bat and a concrete brick, painted a picture not of survival but of overkill. The blood patterns in the room suggested Jason may have been incapacitated, possibly even unconscious, when some of the final strikes landed. If true, this detail would undermine the claim of self-defense, suggesting instead that the attack continued long after the immediate threat had ended. Even stranger was the discovery of the brick itself. Investigators questioned why Molly kept a heavy block of concrete in her bedroom, on her nightstand of all places. Her explanation that she used it as a doorstop and for protection struck many as odd. Was it a makeshift weapon she had kept at hand, anticipating a confrontation? Or was it, as the prosecution would argue, a chilling sign of premeditation? Jason's children, Jack and Sarah, were asleep in the house during the attack. When they awoke, they were confronted with the unimaginable. Their father gone, their stepmother and grandfather insisting it had been necessary. Later, their voices would become critical pieces of evidence. But at that moment, they were 2 traumatized children thrust into the heart of a nightmare. As detectives dug into Jason's life, they began piecing together the weeks and months that led up to the killing. They spoke with his sister, Tracy, who immediately insisted her brother had been murdered. She rejected the Martens' claims of abuse, arguing that Jason's only crime had been wanting to take his children back to Ireland. She pointed to conversations in which Jason had confided his fears about Molly, his plans to leave, and his determination to protect his children. To Tracy, the motive was clear. Molly feared losing the children, and with her father's help, she had eliminated the man who could take them away. From the Martens' perspective, the story was very different. They portrayed Jason as a controlling, volatile man who had grown increasingly unstable. They painted a picture of Molly as a victim, trapped in a marriage where she feared for her safety. To them, the events of that night were tragic but unavoidable, the desperate act of a father saving his daughter from a violent end. But the hard evidence didn't align with their account. Forensic experts testified that Jason's injuries were not consistent with a chaotic struggle. Instead, they suggested a prolonged beating, one that continued after Jason was no longer capable of fighting back. The presence of both weapons, the delay in calling 911, the decision to allow the scene to be professionally cleaned afterward, all of it pointed toward something far darker than the Martens admitted. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from the 911 call itself. While Thomas insisted he had acted in defense of his daughter, the calmness in his voice as he admitted, "I think we killed him," raised eyebrows. It did not sound like the panicked words of a man who had just saved his child from imminent danger. It sounded more like resignation, and perhaps, as prosecutors suggested, even relief. The community in Wahlberg struggled to reconcile the crime with the people involved. Jason, the Irish widower who had come seeking a new start, was now the victim of one of the most brutal killings the town had ever seen. Molly, once seen as a young woman building a family, now stood accused of conspiring in his death. And Thomas, the former FBI agent who had dedicated his career to upholding the law, was now on the other side of it. As news spread back to Ireland, outrage grew. Jason's family flew to the United States, demanding justice, demanding answers. For them, the narrative of self-defense was nothing more than a calculated cover-up. Their brother, their son, their loved one had been slaughtered, and they would not rest until the truth came out. The case quickly became international news. Headlines in both the United States and Ireland chronicled every detail: the violent struggle, the competing stories, the shocking evidence. The Irish public followed closely, galvanized by the sense that one of their own had been betrayed on foreign soil. The American public, meanwhile, was fascinated by the contradictions, a tragic love story that had curdled into a brutal homicide. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they framed the killing not as a moment of panic but as a calculated act. Jason, they argued, had been planning to take his children back to Ireland. Molly and her father, faced with the prospect of losing everything, chose to eliminate him instead. They waited for the right moment, armed themselves with weapons, and struck with such force that Jason never stood a chance. The defense countered with equal passion, insisting that Jason's darker side had been hidden from the public, that Molly had lived in fear, and that Thomas had done what any father would do. But the forensic evidence loomed large, a silent witness that neither side could ignore. Blood spatter, skull fractures, weapon placement, all of it told a story that no amount of testimony could erase. And so, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic trials North Carolina had seen in years. On one side stood the Corbett family, determined to see Jason's killers brought to justice. On the other stood the Martens, a father and daughter bound by blood and by a shared story of survival. When the jury was seated and the testimony began, the world would finally hear both sides laid bare. But even before the first witness took the stand, one question haunted everyone who followed the case. Was Jason Corbett truly the abuser his wife and father-in-law claimed he was? Or was he the victim of a deadly conspiracy, silenced to protect Molly's fragile hold on the children she couldn't bear to lose? The trial of Molly Martens and her father, Thomas, began in the summer of 2017, nearly 2 years after Jason Corbett's brutal death. From the moment jury selection began, the courtroom in Davidson County buzzed with tension. On one side sat Jason's family, who had flown in from Ireland, clutching photographs of the man they believed had been murdered in cold blood. On the other side, the Martens family waited, grim-faced, portraying themselves not as killers, but as survivors of a violent night gone wrong. Prosecutors wasted no time framing the case. In their opening statement, they told the jury that Jason Corbett had been executed in his own home, beaten so savagely that his skull was shattered beyond recognition. They described how Thomas and Molly had delivered at least 10 crushing blows with a baseball bat and concrete brick, continuing even after Jason could no longer fight back. This was not self-defense, the prosecutor thundered. This was murder. The defense countered with a very different picture. They painted Jason as a man with a dark, controlling side. They alleged that Molly endured years of emotional and physical abuse, and that Jason's children had been manipulated to hide their father's violence. Thomas, they argued, was simply doing what any father would do when his child's life was at risk. He didn't want to kill Jason, the defense insisted. He wanted to save Molly. As testimony began, the prosecution leaned heavily on forensic evidence. Blood spatter experts explained how the patterns in the bedroom suggested Jason had been struck while on the ground, perhaps even unconscious. A pathologist described Jason's skull fractures as catastrophic, consistent with repeated, deliberate strikes, not the chaotic swings of self-defense. The 911 call was replayed for the jury. Thomas's calm, almost detached voice as he told the dispatcher, "I think we killed him," hung heavily in the courtroom. Prosecutors argued that this calmness betrayed the truth, that this was not panic but premeditation. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the testimonies from Jason's children, Jack and Sarah. In closed-door sessions and carefully presented statements, the children recalled how their stepmother often belittled and argued with their father. They insisted that Jason never abused Molly, that instead, he had been the one trying to protect them from her. Their voices, trembling but determined, gave the jury a chilling perspective. The supposed victims of Jason's violence did not see him as an abuser at all. The defense tried to poke holes in these claims. They questioned the children's memories, suggesting they had been influenced by Jason's family after his death. They brought in friends and acquaintances of Molly who testified about her fears of Jason, about the bruises she claimed he left on her, and about how she confided she felt trapped in the marriage. But the lack of hard evidence, no medical records, no police reports, no documented history of abuse, made the defense's case difficult to sustain. The turning point came with the testimony about the delay in calling 911. Paramedics had noted Jason's body was colder than expected, leading to speculation that he may have been dead for some time before the call was placed. Why, prosecutors asked, would two innocent people delay seeking help unless they were carefully crafting their story? After weeks of testimony, the jury finally deliberated. On August 9, 2017, they delivered their verdict. Both Molly Martens and Thomas Martens were found guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom erupted. Jason's family wept, embracing each other, while Molly and Thomas sat stunned, tears streaking down their faces. The sentence was harsh. Both were given 20 to 25 years in prison. For Jason's family, the verdict was vindication. His sister Tracy declared, "Justice has been served for Jason." For Molly and Thomas, it was devastating. Their defense team vowed to appeal, insisting the trial had been unfair, that critical evidence about Jason's alleged abuse had been excluded. In the years that followed, the case remained alive in the courts. Appeals were filed, hearings held, and eventually, in 2021, the North Carolina Supreme Court overturned the convictions, ruling that the jury had not been allowed to hear certain evidence that could have supported the Martens' claims of self-defense. The retrial was ordered, throwing the case back into uncertainty.